Committee will come to order. Without objection, the presiding member is authorized to declare a recess at any time. Pursuant to Committee Rule 5B and House Rule 11, the Chair may postpone further proceedings on any question of approving any measure or matter or adopting an amendment on which a recorded vote on the yeas and nays are ordered. Our first item for consideration is H.R. 50, the Unfunded Mandates Information and Transparency Act of 2017. The clerk will designate the bill.
H.R. 50, to provide for additional safeguards with respect to imposing federal mandates and for other purposes.
I ask unanimous consent the bill be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. Without objection so ordered, I now recognize the gentlewoman from North Carolina and the sponsor of the bill, Dr. Fox, for 5 minutes for a statement on the bill.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. In 1995, Congress passed the Unfunded Mandates Reform Act, UMRA, into law to combat the imposition of onerous and costly federal unfunded mandates. But year after year, we've watched this practice grow unabated. States and localities still struggle to implement federal laws and regulations out of their own pockets. Simply put, the law is not working as intended. Not only are unfunded federal mandates a freeze on state and local bank accounts, they are subversions of the principles of American federalism. As the Supreme Court held, these mandates treat states more as servants to be commandeered rather than sovereign partners to be consulted. Under UMRA, state, local, and tribal governments are supposed to have input into the regulatory process, but testimony before this committee shows that incorporation of their input has been limited at best. A Kentucky County executive testified that agencies treat their responsibilities under the law as a, quote, check-a-box, end quote, exercise instead of engaging in meaningful intergovernmental partnership. Officials from various levels of government testified about being stuck between a rock and a hard place because of unfunded mandates, either raise taxes or eliminate services. H.R. 50, the Unfunded Mandates Information and Transparency Act, is intended to get at this very problem. H.R. 50 addresses UMRA's shortcomings by providing openness and honesty about the cost of regulations. It should come as no surprise to any member here that this type of common sense reform has passed through the House on a bipartisan basis in each of the last 3 Congresses. In fact, many of my friends across the aisle were once state legislators, county executives, mayors, and city council members before joining Congress and have an intimate familiarity with the stress these mandates place at all levels of government. This includes the Democrat co-sponsor of my bill, Representative Henry Cuellar of Texas. They understand firsthand the cost federal red tape impose on local communities and the advantages partnering with the private sector has on efficient policymaking. Through our oversight work, this committee has learned about the costly effects unfunded mandates impose on state, local, and tribal governments and the private sector. Last year, OGR received several hundred responses from governors, state legislators, and county officials regarding the specific federal laws and regulations, stalling their state budgetary flexibility and hurting local businesses. Countless accounts illustrated the heavy costs barely funded federal programs have on state and local governments. In the interest of your time, I'm simply going to mention states and territories rather than go into details on the specific examples. Tennessee, Alabama, Oklahoma, Guam, U.S. Virgin Islands as territories. The Department of Education required the Virgin Islands to enter into a contract which reportedly cost more than $33 million between 2006 and 2016. This is a snapshot of the present problem unfunded mandates place on states and territories more than 2 decades after UMRA's passage. H.R. 50 will require federal agencies to undergo a more thorough regulatory process cognizant of costs on affected parties. This provision simply codifies Section 1 of President Clinton's Executive Order 12866 in 1993, which was reaffirmed by President Obama in Executive Order 13563 in 2011. For rules costing $100 million or more in 1 year, referred to as, quote, major rules, agencies have foregone the requirement to prepare written statements in cases where there was no notice of proposed rulemaking prior to the final rule. This was a loophole in UMRA that H.R. 50 closes. H.R. 50 requires agencies to prepare written statements to the Office of Information Regulatory Affairs on all major rules, regardless if they've published a notice of proposed rulemaking. H.R. 50 also requires federal agencies to consider the effects of their regulations on the private sector and consult those affected entities as they would state, local, and tribal governments under UMRA. In the committee's recent hearing on unfunded mandates, North Carolina State Senator Jim Davis testified how costly federal regulations can be for local private businesses. An EPA enforcement officer ordered a business owner from his district to spend over $200,000 to reduce boiler system emissions from 12 parts per million to 4. The only problem, the technology doesn't exist to reduce it to 4. Instead of spending $200,000 on employees, raises, and equipment, he was left spending it on complying with the impossible. Many small businesses are concerned about the growing regulatory state. According to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, almost 45% of small businesses identify overregulation and economic uncertainty as significant challenges. H.R. 50 improves certainty for job creators. H.R. 50 will ensure transparency and consultation in the federal rulemaking process. I urge members to support this bipartisan bill.
The gentlelady from North Carolina yields back. The gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Connolly, is recognized for 5 minutes for a statement on the bill.
I thank the Chair. Mr. Chairman, I oppose H.R. 50, the Unfunded Mandates Information and Transparency Act. Despite its name, H.R. 50 amends the Unfunded Mandates Reform Act, which was enacted as part of then-Speaker Gingrich's contract with America. UMRA, the Gingrich approach, addressed a real problem, and it sought to strike a balance between the need for regulation and the funding burden placed on state and local governments. To strike that balance, it included some limitations that made a lot of sense. This bill repeals many of those limitations. For example, under this bill, agencies would be required to consult with regulated industry on a proposed major rule before the proposal is even made public. This means, for example, that if the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau planned to propose a rule to protect consumers from abusive mortgage practices, banks would get advance access to that rule and the opportunity to reshape it before consumers ever saw it. Or when the Department of Agriculture proposes a rule to prevent salmonella poisoning in chicken and turkey parts, ConAgra and Purdue would have the ability to influence that rule before even food safety experts looked at it. Businesses should have the opportunity to provide comments on proposed rules that affect them, absolutely. And the current system does that. But they should do it through the normal public comment process as allowed under the Gingrich approach, just like other stakeholders. This bill would also put independent agencies in jeopardy of political interference. The Unfunded Mandates Reform Act currently exempts independent agencies from its reporting requirements. This bill removes that exemption. That would mean that independent regulatory agencies like the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau would have to submit their rules to the Office of Management and Budget for review, which could undermine their independence. Section 12 of the bill would require an agency to perform a retrospective review, including an additional cost-benefit analysis of any existing rule if requested by the chairman or ranking member of a committee. The Congressional Research Service in 2015 found that there is an argument that Section 12 is unconstitutional. CRS said at that time, and I quote, "It could be argued that imbuing certain members, and not others, with the authority to demand that an agency prepare a report under Section 12 is an action of sufficient legislative character and effect as to trigger the bicameralism and presentment requirements of Article 1 of the Constitution. These flaws are all reason enough to oppose this bill. The most important reason is that we rely on agency rulemakings to protect our children, protect our workers, and protect our economy. It's also worth noting that in the 114th Congress, CRS found that this bill would result in direct spending of $18 million over 10 years, triggering pay-go procedures. I urge my colleagues to oppose this bill, and I yield back.
The gentleman from Virginia yields back. Does any other member wish to be heard? For what purpose does the gentlelady from North Carolina seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment to the bill at the desk.
Clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 50, offered by Ms. Fox of North Carolina.
Without objection, the amendment is considered as read. The gentlewoman is recognized for 5 minutes to explain the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment addresses a lapsed authorization within the committee's jurisdiction. Specifically, the amendment reauthorizes funds for CBO to perform its duties under the Unfunded Mandates Reform Act, UMRA. The amendment reduces the authorization amount by $3 million because CBO was able to find ways to perform its duties related to UMRA at a lower cost. UMRA directs CBO to prepare mandate statements for legislation approved by authorizing committees. Upon request, CBO will also review intergovernmental and private sector mandates at other legislative stages. CBO determines if the mandate cost will be greater than the UMRA statutory thresholds. This amendment reauthorizes CBO's funding to CBO for $1.5 million from 2018 to 2024 based on its actual expenditures, which are currently around $1.3 million. I urge my colleagues to support this amendment to address one of this committee's lapsed authorizations.
Does any other member wish to be heard?
Mr. Chairman.
Gentlelady from the District of Columbia. I saw both hands at the same time. Gentlelady from the District of Columbia is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, this committee will recall that soon after taking office, the President signed an executive order that created a regulatory reform task force. The task force was to, quote, evaluate existing regulations, make recommendations to the agency head regarding their repeal, replacement, and modification, and identify regulations that eliminate jobs or inhibit job creation or outdated, unnecessary, ineffective, or impose costs that exceed benefits. Mr. Chairman, these task forces have been have the potential to have wide-ranging effect on federal policy, including possible benefit to corporations and other interests. But the administration has kept the names of these task force members secret, and therefore this committee and the Congress is unable to evaluate whether there are any conflicts of interest. There has been a recent New York Times ProPublica investigation that found that the task force members include, and here I am quoting, lawyers who have represented businesses in cases against government regulators, staff members of political dark money groups, employees of industry-funded organizations opposed to environmental rules, and at least 3 people who have registered to lobby the agencies they now work for. On August 7th, Ranking Member Cummings, along with several other members, sent a letter to OMB requesting the names of the task force members, and I raise this at this time because OMB has never responded. The committee staff held briefings with representatives from the task forces. When asked for the names of the task force members, several agencies actually refused to give them. On February 7th, 2018, ranking members Cummings, Nadler, Conley, and Cicilline sent a letter to a dozen executive branch agencies, asking again for these names. To date, 6 agencies still have not provided names of their task force members. They are the Departments of Commerce, Homeland Security, Justice, Labor, State, and Small Business Administration. Mr. Chairman, our committee can, and I believe should, subpoena the names of these task force members. Our committee is about shining light and understanding government regulations. We need to know who exactly has influence in this administration when it comes to these regulations. So I'm asking you, Mr. Chairman, will you permit us to vote on a subpoena to ensure that the 6 agencies that I have just named provide this necessary information to the committee, noting that some of the agencies have provided names? Mr. Chairman?
Gentlelady, yield back.
I yield back and ask that you respond to my question, Mr. Chairman.
The gentlewoman has not been recognized for the purpose of offering a motion to subpoena.
I asked, Mr. Chairman, not for a motion to subpoena, but will you permit us to vote on a subpoena to the agencies that have not responded? I'm asking you, Mr. Chairman. I'm not submitting a motion at this time.
The motion is improper as the item is not on the agenda. Gentlelady yields back. The gentlelady from Illinois. Any other member wish to be heard? If not, the question is now on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from North Carolina. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed signify by saying no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. The question is now on favorably reporting H.R. 50 as amended. All those in favor signify by saying aye. All those opposed signify by saying no.
No. Mr. Chairman,
Yes, sir.
on this vote, I would ask for a recorded vote at the appropriate time later today.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and a recorded vote is ordered. As previously announced, further proceedings on the question will be postponed.
Mr. Chairman,
The gentleman from Virginia is recognized for an opening statement on the markup.
I thank the chair. Mr. Chairman, 5 weeks ago, I sat in this same chair during our previous markup, and I asked the then chairman to let our committee take a vote on 13 different subpoenas. Unfortunately, that request was not honored. At the markup before that in November, Ranking Member Cummings asked for 6 motions for subpoenas, and that request was also ignored. Over the last 5 weeks, we have sent 13 more letters asking for new motions for subpoenas that we think necessary to ensure that this committee gets the documents and testimony we need to fulfill our constitutional duty, Republicans and Democrats, to conduct rigorous oversight. I expect my Republican counterparts will unfortunately once again ignore our need to vote on these subpoenas. We sent a letter Tuesday laying out each and every one of these requests, but to date have no response. Frankly, I just don't get it. I don't know why the choice is being made to protect President Trump and this administration at the expense of our constitutional duty for oversight. It's in our committee's name. We're not the committee for protecting any particular administration or president. We're the Committee on Oversight and Government Reform. I urge everyone to read the letters we've sent. We described each and every one of these requests in separate letters. We explain why these documents are crucial to our investigations, what steps we've taken to get them already, and why at this point we have no alternative but to seek subpoenas. As Ms. Norton just indicated, OMB's ignored a set of requests. Bad precedent. We understand the chairman personally may disagree with our requests, but our committee members deserve an opportunity to debate and vote on these motions. That's all we're seeking today. For example, following many requests from Democratic members, the chairman sent letters to the White House a month ago asking for information about security clearance processes, former Staff Secretary Robert Porter and his status, and the extent to which the White House officials have been working for extended periods of time with only interim security clearances. The White House response came a week late, and it completely blew us off. It provided none of the documents the committee requested, except for a memo issued by the Chief of Staff that was made public 3 weeks earlier. It's time for a subpoena. And, Mr. Chairman, to follow up with this public promise to interview key White House officials, including the Chief of Staff and the White House counsel, to which you've made reference in other venues. In another example, Jared Kushner has become a national security risk, potentially, that I don't think we can continue to ignore. He lost his top secret security clearance, but that was 14 months later. President Trump gave him access to the President's daily brief until just a few weeks ago, when public awareness of Jared Kushner's conflicts of interest and complicated financial dealings made it untenable to continue to do so. His personal financial interests make foreign governments believe, apparently according to press reports, that they might be able to influence him, one of which was Mexico, a country he led a delegation to just a week ago. We don't know if those reports are right or wrong, but we need to find out. That's our job. We asked to subpoena Mr. Kushner to testify before us if he's unwilling to attend voluntarily, but again, those requests have been ignored. For all of these reasons, I would ask to move that this committee authorize and issue subpoenas for documents and testimony on the 13 topics described in my letter with Ranking Member Cummings to you, Mr. Chairman, on Tuesday. The motion for consideration is at the desk, and I would ask for its immediate consideration.
The gentleman has not been recognized for the purpose of offering a motion to subpoena.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes, sir.
might I inquire of the Chair just when might this committee consider a motion for subpoenas on outstanding issues that we believe are worthy of our investigation?
I can't address that, although I will tell you I'm in receipt of your letters, and I'm happy to discuss those matters with you in the proper forum. This would not be that forum.
I appreciate the Chairman's answer. I will work with the Chairman, and I know Ranking Member Cummings will work with the Chairman to try to find a way to proceed. And I respectfully would inform the Chairman that on this side of the aisle, we will persist. I thank the Chair for his consideration.
I thank the gentleman from Virginia, and the gentleman yields back. The next item for consideration is H.R. 1339, the Freedom from Government Competition Act of 2017. The clerk will designate the bill.
H.R. 1339 to require that the federal government procure from the private sector the goods and services necessary for the operations and management of certain government agencies and for other purposes.
I ask unanimous consent the bill be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. Without objection, so ordered. It's my understanding the gentleman from Tennessee and sponsor of the bill, Mr. Duncan, will offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute to the bill. The gentleman is recognized to call up his amendment.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 1339 offered by Mr. Duncan of Tennessee.
Without objection, the amendment is considered as read. The gentleman from Tennessee is recognized for 5 minutes for a statement on the bill and his amendment.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. This is a bill that I introduced in the House and Senator Thune introduced in the Senate. At the first White House Conference on Small Business in 1955, a statement was produced which said, quote, "The federal government will not start or carry on any commercial activity to provide a good or service that can be procured from the private sector," unquote. Each White House Conference on Small Business since then has issued a similar statement or has listed government competition among the top 3 biggest problems facing small business. In response, many years ago, several groups came to me and asked me to introduce a version of this bill, the Freedom from Government Competition Act, at that time. In 1998, I worked with Senator Craig Thomas of Wyoming on this issue. A compromised version of this bill called the Federal Activities and Inventory Reform Act, or FAIR Act, passed into law. It was supported by both sides of the aisle, the business community, the government employee unions, and the Clinton administration. The FAIR Act requires every federal agency to look at what goods and services they are providing and determine if these are inherently governmental or commercial in nature. This act the FAIR Act had done some good, and we've made some progress because of that bill. However, several groups once again came to me in October of 2014 and asked me to write to the Director of the Office of Management and Budget and asked him how many federal employees were now engaged in commercial activities. President Obama's OMB director wrote back in January of 2015 and it said that according to the OMB, 1.12 million, 1,120,000 full-time federal employees were engaged in activities that are commercial in nature. This bill really, though, is not about, it doesn't require contracting out to the private sector just for the sake of contracting out. This bill is about getting the best service at the lowest cost for the taxpayers and giving small businesses a better chance in dealing with the federal government. I've had just about every type of business you can think of come to my office over the years and talk to me about government competition. These businesses range from high-tech ones like engineering firms and low-tech such as landscaping companies. This issue affects mapping and surveying companies, pest control companies, publishing and technology companies, laboratories, hearing aid dealers, alarm system operators, bus companies, and many, many others. In fact, 33 Washington-based national associations have endorsed this group, the largest being the American Chamber of Commerce, but it goes all the way down to the Virginia Small Business Partnership, the American Council of Engineering Companies, the Minority Business Roundtable, and many, many other groups. This bill proposes a very simple concept. If a federal agency is providing a good or service that can be provided by the private sector more efficiently and cost-effectively, we should contract out that good or service. If the federal government can provide that, if the federal government or a federal agency can provide that good or service at a lower cost, we should certainly allow that agency to continue to do so. And this bill does allow that department or agency to do so. This bill provides exceptions to the rule, including requirement by law that the function is to be performed by an agency, by agency employees if it is in the national security interest, that the function is done by the government, or if it is critical to the mission of the government for agency employees to perform the function, or if it is an inherently governmental function and in the public interest that it be performed by the government. Since 2008, there has been a moratorium on even studying these positions to see if we can save taxpayer dollars. And this bill will at least allow those types of studies and allow sort of a competitive procedure to be set up. Under this bill, the rule will require the head of a department or agency or the Secretary of the Department of Defense to periodically conduct a public-private competitive sourcing analysis of functions performed by that agency or the Department of Defense to determine whether to convert the performance of the function by the agency or department to a performance by a contractor. This bill really grew out of work by Dr. Gene Dodaro, who's been one of the most frequent witnesses in front of this committee and is the current head of the GAO. He led a study in 1998 looking at 1,661 cost comparison studies conducted by the Department of Defense between 1979 and 1986 and found that there would be savings of 27%, according to Dr. Dodaro, if there was more contracting out. A Navy report from 1996 showed the Department of Defense agencies conducting these cost comparisons yielded savings of more than 30%. The bill, importantly, takes into consideration agency employees that could be affected by these public-private analysis. The bill requires the head of an agency or department to consult with employees during the public-private competitive sourcing analysis and ensure that their views are considered. I think it's a good bill, and I would like to include at this point in the record the list of all of the groups and associations that are supporting this legislation, and I yield back.
Without objection, and the gentleman from Tennessee yields back. The gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Connolly, is recognized for 5 minutes for a statement on the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I do thank Mr. Duncan for his effort in this regard. I'm not opposed to contracting out for government services. Quite the opposite. I'm a champion of it. I co-chair the Smart Contracting Caucus here in the Congress. I believe the question of insourcing versus outsourcing, however, must never be a matter of theology or ideology or prejudice. We ought to look at whether a service should be done by federal employees or by contracts on a meritorious basis. I believe that a service should be performed by the entity that can best provide service at the best price. For example, under the Federal Information Technology Acquisition Reform Bill, which I co-wrote with our then-chair, Darrell Issa, federal agencies are required, in the interest of cost savings, to close or consolidate government-run data centers and move to the cloud in partnership with the private sector. And I have repeatedly expressed concerns that the 18F office within GSA seems to venture into the domain of the private sector, and that's an inappropriate role. I've opposed legislation that did the opposite of this bill, that presumed the federal government is always the most efficient provider of service. And I've sometimes stepped on toes in my own side of the aisle and with some of the groups that support us in doing that, because it violated this principle of a prejudice about which is better. Neither is better. Neither is per se good or bad. It depends on the circumstances and the expertise and the cost. The amendment, in the nature of a substitute before us, claims that, and I quote, unfair government competition with the private sector of the economy is at an unacceptably high level, both in scope and in dollar volume, and that this unfair competition is detrimental to the United States economic system. That's a pretty sweeping statement. The measure doesn't offer a shred of evidence to support those assertions. And in fact, according to an analysis by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, federal employees comprised 1.9% of the nation's 144 million civilian jobs, hardly a threat to the private sector. And in that same year, the percentage of civilian employment in the U.S. comprised by federal workers equaled its lowest level ever recorded, far below its post-World War II average of 3.3%. So what is the threat we're trying to address here? I'm old enough to remember a few years ago, a Republican Secretary of Defense declared that outsourcing was too high for the Pentagon. He wanted to bring stuff inside. And I fought him on that because he couldn't justify that statement. What is too high? I defended outsourcing. But we have to be consistent here. We can't just substitute one bias for another. Proceeding from the unproven pretext, this bill would make major changes in federal procurement policy that would create new opportunities to reward political cronies and swing the door open, potentially, to corruption. And it would make these changes without providing for any expansion of the government's already strained acquisition force. There are several provisions of this bill that ought to be deeply concerning to members. None is more so than the provisions that would repeal the existing moratorium on the use of the A-76 process at military medical facilities. In 2007, this very committee held a hearing at Walter Reed to examine the neglect of wounded soldiers being treated there without, after experiencing or returning home from Iraq and Afghanistan. Many of my colleagues in this committee were there at that time. The committee's hearing revealed that a key factor creating the conditions, deplorable conditions at Walter Reed at that time, was the use of A-76 to require competition between government workers and contractors. The effects were multifaceted. When asked about a memo that seemed to warn that contracting out could even potentially lead to mission failure, then Army Surgeon General Kevin Kiley admitted that the A-76 competition process, which had been conducted over several years, had affected the workforce negatively. In addition, there had been a long period of time between the award of a contract and the date of the contractor actually beginning work, leading to an exodus of staff and a degradation of care for wounded warriors. It was the scandal at Walter Reed that led Congress to adopt the moratorium that we would now repeal in this bill. Fortunately, since the scandal at Walter Reed, Congress has repeatedly adopted, with broad Republican support, moratoria against the use of the A-76 process, both in the annual appropriations bills and in successive National Defense Authorization Acts. I urge my colleagues to reject this measure and to continue to uphold the decision already made on a bipartisan basis by the House in the past to reject the use of the flawed and faulty A-76 process at Federal agencies, including especially military medical facilities. And I yield back.
The gentleman from Virginia yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 1339 offered by Mr. Farenthold of Texas.
Without objection, the amendment is considered as read. The gentleman from Texas is recognized for 5 minutes for a statement on the amendment.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank my colleague, Mr. Duncan, for introducing this fiscally responsible legislation. While I strongly support almost all of the bill, I'm concerned about the unintended consequences of its scope. That's why I've introduced a simple amendment to exempt the Department of Defense civilian employees at a depot or armory from this bill. The Army Material Command oversees 23 organic industrial base sites that include manufacturing arsenals, maintenance depots, and ammunition plants. Men and women all across the country work hard at these facilities to manufacture and reset Army equipment, generate readiness and operational capability, and, most importantly, with a fiscal analysis, save the government money. Our friend and colleague, Representative Russell from Oklahoma, has the privilege to represent the McAllister Army Ammunition Plant, which produces and renovates ammunition for our military. This plant employs nearly 1,500 Army civilians and generated a revenue of $215 million in fiscal year 2016. Located in the district I represent is the Corpus Christi Army Depot, known as CCAD, which is the most productive depot in the country. It's the largest industrial employer in South Texas with over 3,600 civilian employees, and it provides an annual local economic input of more than $2 billion. CCAD saves taxpayers millions each year by repairing and upgrading our helicopters for much less than the cost to purchase a new one. For example, to rebuild a UH-60 Blackhawk saves $9 million over buying a new one. Article 1 of the Constitution charges Congress with the duty to provide for a strong national defense. And while I'm confident of the ability of CCAD and other depots and armories alike to do their job in the defense of our nation in a cost-effective manner, this legislation would revoke the moratorium on A-76 studies that the House has just voted to maintain in January of last year. Additionally, Title 10 of USC 2466 provides what's known as the 50-50 Depo Core Law. Basically, this law provides depot maintenance be a public-private venture. The law says not more than 50% of the funds made available in a fiscal year to the military department or a defense agency for depot-level maintenance and repair workload may be used to contract for the performance by non-federal government personnel of such workload for the military or the Department of Defense. Any such formula that is not used for such a contract shall be used for the performance of depot-level maintenance and repair work by employees of the Department of Defense. The Code provides for the Secretary of Defense to waive this provision for reasons of national security, provided that the Secretary consult with Congress. This law has served our nation well. It's protected our national security industrial base by ensuring we have the organic capability owned and operated by the U.S. government. We must ensure that our U.S. government retains this capability for a number of reasons. It allows for us to have surge capability. It also allows to keep competition between the public and private sector and help keeping the pricing of the work that depots do, both public and private, at fair market rates. If we break this rule, what will occur is the private sector will have the opportunity to monopolize depot-type work and, most disturbingly, be able to raise their rates. Another issue I'm concerned about is the private sector may decide certain depot-level work or parts manufacturing is no longer cost-effective for them to perform domestically or at all, thus leaving the U.S. government in a tough situation in the event of war. Under this bill, without my amendment, the U.S. government depot system, which includes our arsenals and all of our industrial facilities, could become endangered. It's imperative that we keep our military depots vibrant, and it directly impacts our national security readiness. My amendment ensures that our depots are protected in a way that they must be to keep our aircraft and helicopters repaired and keep our warfighters ready in any event. The Congress serves the people of the United States and should therefore be continuously striving to improve their public service, not flip-flopping on important issues that could adversely affect the lives and security of our constituents who have trusted us to represent their interests across the globe. With this, I urge my colleagues to support this amendment, providing safeguards and continuity for the civilians employed by our nation's depots and armories, and making sure our warfighters are well-equipped and prepared. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman from Texas yields back. Does any other member wish to be heard on this amendment? The gentlelady from New York is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank Mr. Farrenhall for his hard work. But basically, as I understand it, your amendment would add to that list of exemptions depot-level maintenance and repair, correct? And I am curious why public-private competitions are good for all of the other functions of DoD performed by civilian employees, except for the depot maintenance and repair.
Will the gentlelady yield?
Absolutely, I'm asking a question.
So there's the 50-50 rule that ensures that our depots work with the private sector. And in fact, many of the parts and work is done in partnership with the private sector. For instance, at the Corpus Christi Army Depot, there are various employees of companies like Boeing and Sikorsky there working with the depot and providing parts. It's a team effort in which is that 50-50 rule keeps the competition there not only between different private sector companies, but between the government and the private sector that keeps all the costs down.
Well, maybe it doesn't. Maybe it costs more with the 50-50 rule. So I'm really struggling to understand why depots are singled out for this exception, but why not medical facilities? Why not something else? You know, there's an article that I read last night in the Washington Post, if it's in my mind, soldiers face neglect. And I'm quoting from it. There were signs of neglect everywhere: mouse droppings, belly-up cockroaches, stained carpets, cheap mattresses. You know, I could say, well, we should have an exception here too. So I'm opposed to it. I don't think you should start with the exceptions. I think we already have a public-private item going there. I'd like a cost-benefit analysis done before. Who knows, maybe having the private sector cooperate might even cost more money. So I am opposed to this amendment, and I yield my remaining time to Mr. Connolly.
I thank my colleague, and I just wanted to build on what she just said. It's my understanding, and I wonder if it's my colleague from New York's understanding, depot maintenance and repair is actually a term of art defined in law in 10 U.S. Code 2460. Is that her understanding as well?
That's my understanding.
And that term of art only covers part of the work performed in depots. So, for example, not included in that definition would be lots of other parts of the rubric of core logistics and sustainment activities, such as planning, design, engineering, research systems integration, management, operational support, human resources, et cetera. So even putting aside the issue of, is it a good idea to start already before we've even considered the bill for vote, we're going to have carve-outs. The carve-out identified is problematic given the fact that the definition of depot maintenance and repair is not all-encompassing. And so we're going to have trouble on the ground, in an arsenal, in a depot, trying to figure out which part is carved out and which part is not. And I yield back to my friend from New York.
Thank you very much. You raised a very valid point. I don't think we should get ourselves all tied up in knots trying to have these carve-outs. I'm opposed to this amendment, and I think that I appreciate his hard work and his earnestness on it, but it's the underlying bill is also flawed, but this makes it even more difficult, and I don't think we should get into the area of doing carve-outs. It just makes it more complicated, and particularly this one has problems. Now you're back.
The gentlelady from New York yields back. The gentleman from Georgia is recognized for 5 minutes on this amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I support the amendment and the underlying bill, and I sincerely want to thank Mr. Duncan for his leadership on this issue for years, and for the committee taking it up here, and my friend from Texas for the amendment as well. Look, I mean, the bottom line with all of this is if an agency is doing something that the private sector can do, oftentimes at a much lower cost and more efficiently, then they should be able to do so. And of course, if the government is able to do that same job efficiently and at the best cost, then they should be able to do so as well. But this opens up competition, and no question will save money. And within that, there are some activities that the government alone does best, and they need to do so, such as national defense and law enforcement. And those types of things should not be done by the private sector, and they're not included in this legislation. But we have over 1 million full-time federal employees that are engaged in commercial activities. That's a lot of people who are duplicating activities that are already provided in the private sector. And so all this bill does is allow for competition between the agencies and the private sector as to who can do a better job, and that helps the American taxpayer, which is our responsibility here to look after, to watch out for. And so, I think state and local governments have already accepted this wisdom. It's long past time for we to accept the same thing here in the federal government, and I urge my colleagues to support both the underlying bill and this amendment. Let's keep the taxpayers in mind and the best interests of our country in mind, and I urge support of both of these, and I yield back. Thank you.
Gentleman from Georgia yields back. The gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized for 5 minutes on this amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As a representative of an Army depot, the Tobyhanna Army Depot in northeastern Pennsylvania, I can't stress enough my opposition to my colleague from Texas's amendment. Quote, depot maintenance and repair, unquote, is a term of art that is defined by Title 10, United States Code, Section 2460, and covers only part of the work that is performed in depots and hardly any of the work performed in arsenals or ammunition plants or the rest of the organic industrial base. It does not cover or include very crucial core logistics and sustainment work such as engineering, systems integration, planning, program support, or even management and admin, and the multitude of vital supply and manufacturing activities, plus IT functions performed at a depot on a daily basis. We have firsthand experience with what happens to depots when they receive a carve-out. The last time they got one was when the Senate gave a carve-out on something, and we wound up with a compromise in the final bill where depots ended up with a worse deal than anything else in the Department of Defense. There are countless reasons why everyone should be exempt from A76, but depots always end up at the short end of the stick because organic industrial facilities are the one place where DOD can, quote, study, unquote, or compare, quote, unquote, numerous civilians at one time due to the fact that that is where there are large numbers of civilians employed compared to the military. Now, I've spoken with the American Federation of Government Employees, AFGE, and their representative who specifically works to cover depot issues for Tobyhanna Army Depot, and I can assure you this amendment does not have their support. In fact, I received a copy of AFGE's opposition letter to the bill this morning. It is a letter from Mr. J. David Cox, and it specifically states, quote, we oppose any amendment that would purport to carve out depot maintenance and repair. Depot maintenance covers only a portion of crucial activities performed by facilities we consider depots, unquote. And, Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to include Mr. Cox's letter in the record.
Without objection.
So I would urge my colleague from Texas, a fellow representative of a depot, to withdraw this amendment and would further urge my other colleagues to oppose this amendment should it not be withdrawn. Mr. Chairman, thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman from Pennsylvania yields back. Does any other member wish to be heard on this amendment? The gentleman from Oklahoma is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I certainly thank Representative Duncan for his hard work on trying to cut waste, and we certainly want to do that. And I thank my colleague from Texas, Mr. Farenthold, for trying to address some of the concerns that I think many of us have. However, I don't think the amendment goes far enough. Mr. Chairman, the Department of Defense has a civilian workforce of approximately 740,000 people. In the fiscal year 2018 Defense Authorization, the House Armed Services Committee, of which I am a part, put in place several provisions of acquisition reform, including provisions that require the Department of Defense to conduct oversight over contracting services. Currently, the DoD and Congress have limited insight into how and where $144 billion of contract services in DoD is spent. The Department of Defense is currently working to provide itself and Congress additional oversight over how this contracting money is spent. And a Pentagon audit is due this year, and Secretary Mattis has stated publicly that the deadline will be met. But this bill and even the amendment, which tries to correct some provisions but will still make it problematic, this bill would undermine the intent of the Defense Authorization by pushing more government operations to contracted services. We should first get a handle on how contractor money is spent, particularly within the Department of Defense, before we push more government functions to contractors without that data and analysis. Contractors have caused major national security issues for the United States. Think Edward Snowden, think OPM. Disasters that this committee has had to deal with after extensive damage has been done. The government has tried public-private competitions before with regard to national security, and the success of those exercises is debatable, if not problematic. In fact, the coalition of 33 members supporting this legislation, not including the amendment which was just introduced, has no national security advocates on their list. The GAO and Department of Defense IG found that hoped-for savings from these competitions failed to materialize after the cost and competition itself, disruptions in agency performance, and technical failures of contractors were accounted for. A military analysis of the A-76 study even went further, highlighting key operational impacts to our forces on the battlefield and confusing non-combatants on the battlefield, which creates incredible legal and problematic challenges in the laws of land warfare. Last year, the House adopted in a bipartisan manner an amendment by Representative Matt Cartwright, our colleague here and my friend on the committee, as well as my fellow Oklahoman, Representative Tom Cole, to the Military Construction and VA Appropriations Bill that would prohibit this type of public-private competition because of the dangers it has to our national security. Chief among the concerns were the elimination of engineering and systems integration. We should make an effort to have leaner government. However, there is often the case there is nothing so hard in government that we cannot make harder. I believe that this amendment is trying to correct some measures, and I applaud my colleague from Texas in trying to get at that. I know he understands these issues, and I applaud my friend and colleague, Representative Duncan, who I have the highest admiration for, but I will be opposing this bill, and I will be opposing all of the constructs that I presently see because they will create dangers to national security that fellow warriors, of which I have been one in the past under similar measures that we've done, will suffer under these measures, however well-intended.
Would my friend yield?
I would be glad to.
I thank my friend from Oklahoma, and once again, he brings common sense to this table. I know that he and I and others have worked on the outsourcing of a different federal agency and its assets. And the idea that a priori one believes outsourcing is always better is a risk. And I think my friend from Oklahoma just highlighted what that risk is, in this case to national security. And the other example I'm thinking of, it's in the area of commercial safety, air safety. And so I do applaud both of my colleagues for their efforts, but I share Mr. Russell's sentiment, and will be joining him in that vote.
The gentleman from Oklahoma yields back. Does any other member wish to be heard on this amendment? Gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Lynch.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I just want to say that I have enormous respect for the gentleman from Tennessee. He and I have worked on many issues together. I think the people of Tennessee have been well served, and the people of the country have been well served by his time here in Congress. He's had a lot of great ideas over the years, but this is not one of them. Here's the problem, and I understand the spirit of his bill. It's just that in execution, I think that it falls far short. I think
The amendment demonstrates, the amendment by the gentleman from Texas demonstrates that he wants to sort of exempt a certain part of it. I think the gentleman from Oklahoma and Mr. Cartwright have both pointed out that that does not go far enough, and it leaves a lot to be desired in terms of improving the bill. I just want to point out that, in addition to what Mr. Conley, the gentleman from Virginia, has pointed out with regard to Walter Reed, we had that A-76 contract. I was on the committee then. What a mess. And our veterans were not well served down at Walter Reed. We had a private company come in there, IAP World Services. We went from 300 federal employees eventually down to 50 IAP employees who were put in their place, and it was just a mess. Those veterans deserved better than the treatment they got from IAP. But we had to get down, and we eventually straightened it out. I'll give another example. Members of this committee, myself included, were involved in the AEY contract investigation in Afghanistan. Now, we had a young fellow there under a private contract, got a $300 million contract. I think they made a movie out of this eventually. It was so bad. A 21-year-old Ephraim Diveroli, and he was able to get a private government contract for $300 million. Ended up going around the country, going around the world rather, buying rejected and obsolete junk weapons and selling them actually to U.S. Special Forces and also to the Afghan National Army and their border security patrols. We've had situations where Halliburton in Iraq under private contracts, where they were charging $45 for a case of soda and charging us $100 to clean a 15-pound bag of laundry. And meanwhile, they're housing their executives in five-star hotels in Kuwait. We've had problems with Katrina contracting under FEMA. This last rescue effort or relief effort in Puerto Rico, we had a contract for $156 million to provide 30 million emergency meals. They gave it to a woman, a one-person company, and that she subcontracted it out to another smaller company with 11 people. It's just a mess. So while the desire, as the gentleman from Oklahoma has pointed out, while the desire is to save money, oftentimes other priorities in this government go right down the tubes. And I'll give one final example about government employees. I got elected on September 11th. When I was trying to come here and get sworn in, we had problems. There was anthrax in a lot of the buildings. There was anthrax in the Brentwood postal facility not far from here. And we had two gentlemen, Joseph Kersine Jr. and Thomas Morris Jr., both postal employees, who died from inhalation anthrax. And here's the rub. Now, there were fair warning that some individuals were putting this anthrax in the mail. And so every postal employee in the country and their union representatives were faced with the dilemma whether they could go into work and expose them and their families to anthrax inhalation, which in some cases was fatal. So if those were private employees, I doubt very much that they would put themselves in harm's way just for the daily wage. But our postal employees, God bless them, they stepped up, they went to work, they kept this country going, delivering mail to every home and business in America during those days. We have never properly thanked them for that. But there is a qualitative difference between why a government employee is in that job and their patriotism to this country that isn't fully compensated by the check they get every couple of weeks. And I just think we're ignoring that under this bill, and I encourage my colleagues to vote against the amendment and against the bill, and I yield back.
The gentleman from Massachusetts yields back. The gentleman from Tennessee is recognized for 5 minutes on this amendment.
Well, very briefly, Mr. Chairman, I know you want to move on, but this amendment is acceptable to me, and I think it's in the spirit, goes with the spirit of the bill, and I accept it, or agree with for two main reasons. Already there's a national security carve-out or exception in the bill. So that's one thing. And the second thing is, and my understanding is, there's already a provision in the law that Army and military depots can contract out up to 50% of their work, and they're already doing that in many cases. And then the third thing is, of course, that people maybe don't realize, but all this bill does is set up a competitive procedure to allow something to be done by the private sector if it can be done more efficiently, more cost-effectively. But it also would allow federal employees working for a particular department or agency, if they can show that they can do something more efficiently or more cost-effectively than a private contractor is presently doing something, they have the right to show that and possibly get something that's being done by a private contractor now move back to their particular department or agency. I yield back.
Gentleman from Tennessee yields back. The gentleman from Maryland is recognized for 5 minutes on this amendment. Professor Raskin.
Mr. Chairman, thank you so much. I want to first align myself with the comments of Mr. Lynch and Mr. Russell, who gives us a very thoughtful and common sense approach to the Fair and Hold Amendment. The Fair and Hold Amendment has come in for a bit of a bipartisan criticism here by colleagues who say that it seems like an arbitrary carve-out from the overall policy, which of course it is, and I think that it's much more telling and instructive to think of it as criticism of the policy. I think that the amendment would be better served as simply an opposition to the overall bill, because the kinds of complaints that the gentleman raises, I think lots of us have in our own districts. Now, I happen to represent the Walter Reed National Medical Center, which is in my district, so I'm well aware of the history related to the abuses and the recklessness and neglect that took place at Walter Reed under the A76 process. The hospital remained a gem and a miracle, but the lodge where the returned soldiers were living was absolute chaos. It was a mess. There were mice, there were rats, there were cockroaches, broken elevators, the heat didn't work, the water didn't work. It was an absolute scandal, and that's what led this committee to adopt a moratorium on privatizing and outsourcing and subjecting to A76 the military hospitals. This bill would repeal the moratorium. And so I think if we're going to try to fix what is the very flawed vehicle of the legislation, we should start by stripping the repeal of the moratorium. Like Mr. Farenthold, I've got a facility which has a huge economic impact in my district. He said that the depot that he wants to exempt from the legislation has a $2 billion impact in his district. Walter Reed has a $1.5 billion impact in my district with 20,000 jobs. So it's got a similar kind of impact in my district that the depots have there, except in my case, I also have a demonstrable history, which is well recorded, which has been acted on by this committee and by Congress to carve us out from the A76 process. And this legislation would drag us back to precisely the conditions that the committee recognized on a bipartisan basis were unacceptable. So I'm very sympathetic with what Mr. Farenthold is saying. I wonder if he would be interested in expanding it to include stripping out the repeal of the moratorium provisions. I would be much more interested in the amendment at that point. Otherwise, it does to me look like a bit of arbitrary special pleading on behalf of one member in one district, and of course, that's not the best way for us to legislate. And with that, I'll yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman from Maryland yields back.
Before the gentleman from Maryland yields back, Mr. Chairman, might I just ask a question?
Yes, by all means.
With the indulgence of the Chair.
Certainly.
Is it also not true, you cite the fact that our committee looked at this back in 2007, is it also not true that that moratorium was enshrined in the law in the Defense Authorization Act because our friends, pursuant to Mr. Russell's point, in both national security and defense, recognized this problem
But absolutely. I mean, I don't want us to have short-term memory loss about this. This was a huge crisis and a scandal that everybody agreed should not be taking place. I mean, we had hundreds of people returning from the Iraq War who were plunged into conditions which they likened to the combat conditions that they had seen over in Iraq. And so, you know, I would hate for this legislation just to silently overturn this moratorium without our talking about it.
Right.
And again, I don't know if Mr. Farenthold would be interested in expanding his amendment to include this broad problem, which is, you know, a matter of historical record. If not, I think I will go ahead to try to amend it in that direction.
Well, as I was pointing out to my friend, and I know he agrees, it's not only a matter of historical record, it's a matter of law.
It's a matter of law, absolutely.
Congress recognized this specific issue being a problem, at least in the context of military medical facilities such as Walter Reed, and I thank my friend for yielding.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, I'll yield back to you.
The gentleman from Maryland yields back. Does any other member seek to be heard on this? The gentleman from Tennessee is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Palmer has come to me with some things that he thinks feel under that could be under the jurisdiction of his subcommittee that could improve this bill and expand it in some respects, but also meet some of the objections that have been raised thus far. I appreciate the kind words from the gentleman from Oklahoma and the gentleman from Massachusetts in particular, but at this point, I ask unanimous consent to postpone consideration of this bill at this point.
Without objection, consideration of the bill will be postponed to a future date. Our next item for consideration is H.R. 2846, the Federal Agency Customer Experience Act of 2017. The clerk will designate the bill.
H.R. 2846, to require the collection of voluntary feedback on services provided by agencies and for other purposes.
I ask unanimous consent the bill be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. Without objection, so ordered. It's my understanding the gentleman from Texas and the sponsor of the bill, Mr. Farenthold, will offer an amendment. In the nature of a substitute to the bill, the gentleman is recognized to call up his amendment.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 2846, offered by Mr. Farenthold of Texas.
Without objection, the amendment is considered as read. The gentleman from Texas is recognized for 5 minutes for a statement on the bill and his amendment.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Have you ever noticed that it often appears that customer service from some federal agencies lags behind the private sector? Well, according to a 2017 American Customer Satisfaction Index, the federal government as a whole is near the bottom of all industries in the United States when it comes to customer satisfaction. The government can and should do better. In the business world, companies understand the importance of customer service. Their bottom line often depends on the quality of their service. And companies use feedback as a way to measure their customers' overall experience. We've all received requests for feedback from credit card companies, cable companies, restaurants, grocery stores, just about any other place that you do business. But you probably haven't gotten one from the federal government, because federal agencies generally do not collect feedback because they don't have to compete for customers, and under current law, it's difficult for them to do. Without customer feedback, agencies and programs do not, and in fact cannot, consider the customer experience. This bill and the amendment will give the agencies the ability to think about their programs and service in a new way. The Federal Agency Customer Experience Act, the FACE Act, allows government agencies to collect voluntary, and that's the key word here, voluntary feedback on the services they provide. After a transaction with a federal program, individuals will have the option to answer a short questionnaire about their experience. The voluntary questionnaire will address the individual's satisfaction with a specific interaction and ensure that they were treated with respect, dignity, and professionalism. Take, for example, a veteran calling the Veterans Administration to ask about educational opportunities under the GI Bill. After the call, the veteran will have the chance to leave feedback on whether their questions were answered and how they were treated. Under H.R. 2846, the responses to all questions asked by the agencies will be completely voluntary. The amendment in the nature of a substitute makes a few technical changes to make that clear. Responses will be anonymous, and all personally identifiable information will be protected from disclosure. H.R. 2846 requires the agencies to publish and submit to the Director of the Office of Management and Budget an annual report with the results of the aggravated, that may be how some customers feel, but aggregated is the word I was looking for, the aggregated feedback that they've collected. Results of the report will be used to improve transactions and services provided by the government. Finally, the Comptroller General of the United States will create a scorecard report with the data from all agencies. This scorecard will help ensure that the federal government is taking customer service seriously. After all, the customer is the taxpayer, and the agencies and their employers owe it to the taxpayers to provide high-quality service. I encourage all of my colleagues to support this legislation and the amendment in the nature of a substitute to improve everyone's experience with the federal government. And I yield back.
Gentleman from Texas yields back. The gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Conley, is recognized for 5 minutes for a statement on the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank my friend from Texas for a thoughtful bill. I think, you know, the late mayor of New York, Mr. Koch, used to go around New York going, "How am I doing?" He was seeking feedback. And I think that is always a useful thing, both in the private and public sector. And so I know this bill passed the Senate, companion bill introduced by Senator Claire McCaskill of Missouri, and it passed unanimously. And I think requiring federal agencies to collect voluntary feedback from the public can be very helpful in terms of their customizing their service. A word of caution, however, when Congress starves an agency of resources, it will skew the results because, of course, customer service suffers. The IRS is an example that comes to mind. I know my friend from Maryland is going to have, I believe, an amendment to address that subject, but I do support the underlying bill, and I thank Mr. Fernthal for his thoughtful contribution. And I also look forward to supporting my friend from Maryland when he moves his amendment. I yield. Do you want me to yield to my? I yield to my friend from Maryland.
Good. Thank you very much for yielding, Mr. Conley. The amendment, I hope, would be amenable and acceptable to everybody on the committee. It simply says, it is the sense of Congress that adequate federal funding is needed to ensure agency staffing levels that can provide the public with appropriate customer service levels. I think it states a common sense expectation that is complementary to the purpose of the legislation.
Is reclaiming my time, is my friend from Maryland moving that amendment?
I would move that amendment. I don't know, Mr. Chairman.
Would the gentleman yield?
Yes, by all means.
Because I
was going to yield to the chairman and then to the
Actually,
gentleman.
it's my time.
Oh, I'm sorry.
But, Mr. Chairman, I believe my friend from Maryland has moved an amendment.
As a professor of both substantive and due process, I'm sure Professor Raskin will appreciate the fact that I will need to call up his amendment, and we can, unless there's someone who wishes to be heard on the underlying bill, I will ask the clerk to designate the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 2846, offered by Mr. Raskin of Maryland.
Without objection, the amendment is recognized as read, and the gentleman from Maryland, to the extent he would like to opine more, is recognized for 5 minutes for a statement on the bill and his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think I've opined sufficiently. I think the gentlelady from the District of Columbia wanted to be heard on it.
We're co-sponsoring this amendment. If you
Yes.
want to go first, go ahead.
Well, but all I wanted to say was I think it states a necessary and complementary point to the purpose of the legislation, which is that the people are our customers and they should have the right to feedback. We should be soliciting it. We should know how we're doing at the public. And at the same time, we need adequate federal funding to ensure that agency staffing levels are appropriate and sufficient to meet the demands of the people. And with that, I yield to my co-sponsor, the gentlelady from the District of Columbia.
Thank you. I thank my good friend for yielding. I just want to say how much the notion of feedback, how important that is. I mean, all of us go to community meetings because we run every 2 years. We want to get as much feedback as we can before we run. I mean, this really goes to every aspect of life. And this is only an expression of the sense of Congress. It doesn't say put money in. It doesn't say we must have an appropriation in order for this matter to go forward. But it does indicate that what we have is a very diligent workforce. And if we're going to ask them to do more, it would be, I think, an expression of understanding that with the extraordinary work that they do, the extraordinary efficiency that they have shown, because there have been almost no increases in appropriations for federal workers, that there's a sense of Congress. And I don't think anybody would object if somehow money did come forward. I don't think my colleagues on the other side would say this is inappropriate. So since this amendment would not require anything, but would indicate that the Congress wants the same kind of feedback, but understands that everything we ask federal workers to do may involve some resources, and I ask that the amendment be considered in that light, and I yield back.
The gentlelady from the District of Columbia yields back. The chair will recognize himself very briefly, simply to thank Chairman Farenthold for his work on this issue, and to thank Professor Raskin and Congresswoman Eleanor Holmes Norton. I can't imagine why anyone would not want to acknowledge that good public service is an important facet of public and government work. So support the amendment. And does any other member seek recognition on the, or seek to be heard on this amendment? The gentleman from Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And while I'm supportive of the amendment, I do want to say that throwing money at a problem does not necessarily solve it. But I do agree with the spirit of the amendment that there do need to be adequate resources. We've got a great federal workforce that needs to be adequately compensated. But I do not think in all instances throwing money at a service issue necessarily solves it. There may be other problems associated with that, and I just wanted that to be on the record, though I do support the amendment.
And on that note of harmony, the gentleman from Texas yields back. Does any other member wish to be heard on this amendment? If not, the question is now on the amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by Mr. Raskin. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying no. The opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. Does any other member wish to be heard on H.R. 2846 or the amendment in the nature of a substitute? If not, the question is now on the amendment of the nature of a substitute as amendment. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed signify by saying no. The opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. The question is now on favorably reporting H.R. 2846 as amendment. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed signify by saying no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the bill is ordered favorably reported as amended. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. Our next item for consideration is H.R. 4809, the Guidance Out of Darkness Act, or the GOOD Act. The clerk will designate the bill.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
H.R. 4809, to increase access to agency guidance documents.
I ask unanimous consent the bill be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk may designate the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 4809, offered by Mr. Walker of North Carolina.
Without objection, the amendment is considered as read. The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes for his statement on the bill and his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. To circumvent responsibility and the legal rulemaking process, previous administrations had federal agencies issue guidance to serve as de facto regulations. Regulatory guidance is widely used by agencies. The guidance affects industries and taxpayers alike, but the precise extent of its use is unknown. Professor Nicholas Perillo, who testified before the committee just yesterday, explained, and I quote, "There is no comprehensive compilation of guidance, but everyone agrees its volume is oceanic." While the regulations themselves are often erroneous and harmful, the guidance documents are sporadically posted on agency websites, and the websites of component agencies and various offices, some are not posted at all. This inconsistency burdens regulated entities, and particularly small businesses who may not have the resources to hire compliance staff to seek out this information. H.R. 4809 requires transparency and accountability in the regulatory process. The public deserves to have this information. They deserve to know how the agencies administering our laws interpret those laws and regulations. H.R. 4809, with the amendment in the nature of a substitute, requires agencies to post their guidance documents online in one centralized location. Agencies create these documents and expect the guidance to be followed. The agency should therefore have no problem gathering and posting documents as the bill requires. In fact, we know that many agencies already have a list because they have provided it to us. The committee has been reviewing information about thousands of pieces of agency guidance now for several months. At the committee's request, federal agencies provided information on more than 12,800 guidance documents issued over the past decade. And that is just a portion of federal guidance documents. That number is expected to increase as agencies continue to identify guidance and produce information to the committee. There are a handful of agencies that have been unable to produce a list of guidance documents. That is a red flag and a clear indication that at some agencies, guidance documents are not even tracked. If an agency doesn't bother to track the hundreds of guidance documents it issues, how can businesses and taxpayers possibly be expected to comply with them? The burden should be on the agencies to make guidance documents easy to find. That's all this bill does. Require agencies to post information they should already have in centralized locations. That is a simple step agencies can take that would have significant benefits. Posting these documents in a central location will alleviate burdens on regulated entities and members of the public. It will shine light on this lesser understood yet impactful sector of federal regulatory activity. This legislation is common sense reform that members of both parties can support in the name of good governance and transparency. I urge my colleagues to support this bill and the amendment in the nature of a substitute. And with that, I yield back.
The gentleman from North Carolina yields back. I'll now recognize the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Connolly, for 5 minutes for a statement on the bill.
I thank the Chair, and I thank our friend for introducing the good act, which is designed to make agency guidance documents more transparent, a good thing. But what we want to make sure, and I want to work with my friend as we move toward bringing this to the floor, we need some clarification, I think, in language. I'd like to introduce, Mr. Chairman, into the record a letter from the Committee from the Coalition for Sensible Safeguards, which is an alliance of 175 organizations who have been interested in this bill and have suggested that we adopt some language that our Senate counterparts have that would further clarify the bill and ensure that we are achieving the goal here of transparency and not something else.
Without objection.
I thank my friend. Assuming my friend, the author of the bill, is willing to work with us to try to clarify language as we move forward, so that the intent of the bill is the intent of the bill and not something else. And I just point out that Senator Johnson in the Senate at one point said that the Congressional Review Act, that they were prepared to use that to overturn guidance documents. And he said, with respect to this, he said, it would open all kinds of mischievous types of guidance to outright repeal. All the Trump administration would have to do is finally issue the report on a guidance, and the clock would start ticking, so we have total ball control on this. I don't think that's the intent of my friend with respect to this bill, and we just want to work with him to make sure that we're achieving what was laid out, and we will be supportive of that as we move forward. My friend can respond if he wishes.
The gentleman from Virginia yields to the gentleman from North Carolina.
Yes, I believe the only question in there was, would we be willing to work? And my answer would be absolutely.
I thank my friend, and I yield back.
The gentleman from Virginia yields back. Does any other member wish to be heard? If not, the question is now on the amendment in the nature of a substitute. Those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed signify by saying no. The opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. Question is now on favorably reporting H.R. 4809 as amended. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Those opposed signify by saying no. And the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. And the bill is ordered favorably reported as amendment. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. Next item for consideration is H.R. 5253, the Office of Government Information Services Empowerment Act of 2018. The clerk will designate the amendment. The bill.
H.R. 5253 to amend Section 552H of Title V, United States Code to require agencies provide records to the Director of the Office of Government Information Services.
Ask unanimous consent the bill be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. Without objection, so ordered. I now recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Farenthold, for 5 minutes for a statement on the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Office of Government Information Service, in our acronym in the government known as OGIS, was established by the Open Government Act of 2007. OGIS serves dual roles as a neutral mediator of disputes between Freedom of Information Act, we call that FOIA, requesters and agencies, and as an auditor and evaluators of agencies' FOIA programs. To fill its statutory duty to review agency compliance with FOIA, OGIS must access the agency's FOIA record. I mean, that's common sense. Unfortunately, however, some agencies have not provided access to the records OGIS needs to complete its statutory duties due to administrative requirements under the Privacy Act. Currently, OGIS must jump through a number of administrative hoops to access those records and carry out their statutory duty. It's made it very difficult for OGIS to complete the task it was assigned by Congress, to review agency compliance with the Freedom of Information Act. By requiring agencies to disclose records to OGIS under FOIA, the agencies can use the FOIA exemption to the Privacy Act. This bill will guarantee OGIS has access to records at each agency. This does not mean those records will be used for any purpose beyond conducting the statutorily required review. The Ojas Empowerment Act is a fitting bill for moving through this committee as we are nearing the end of Sunshine Week. Ensuring agencies comply with the Freedom of Information Act, it's vital that we improve government transparency. This bill does that. OGIS is an important partner in oversight of the Freedom of Information Act process. The Ojas Empowerment Act of 2018 will provide OGIS the means to complete its very important statutory duties, and I urge my colleagues to support this bill. Yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair will now recognize the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Connolly, for 5 minutes for a statement on the bill.
I thank the Chair. I just want to express support for the Office of Government Information Services Empowerment Act, and I want to thank both my friend from Texas and my friend from Pennsylvania, Mr. Cartwright, for their leadership in this bill. The Office of Government Information Services is charged with reviewing agency compliance with FOIA. This bill strengthens the authority of that office by clarifying that other federal agencies must provide records to the office in order for it to carry out its statutory responsibilities. The bill would provide greater accountability for FOIA compliance. It's a good government measure. I support it and urge its passage and yield back.
The gentleman from Virginia yields back. Does any other member wish to be heard? If not, the question is on favorably reporting H.R. 5253, the House of Representatives. Those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed signify by saying no. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The bill is ordered favorably reported. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. Next item for consideration is H.R. 1376, the Electronic Message Preservation Act of 2017. The clerk will designate the bill.
H.R. 1376 to amend Title 44 United States Code to require preservation of certain electronic records by federal agencies, to require a certification and reports relating to presidential records, and for other purposes.
I ask unanimous consent the bill be considered as read and open for amendment at any time without objection to order. And I'll now recognize the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Ross, for 5 minutes for a statement on the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, the Electronic Message Preservation Act will ensure the federal government will continue to take the necessary steps to help modernize its record-keeping infrastructure. Despite the significant shift to electronic communication over the last 2 decades, many federal agencies are just now moving away from a, quote, print-to-file method of electronic record preservation. Paper-based record systems for electronically created records are inefficient, prone to loss, and difficult to manage. On December 31st, 2016, an OMB directive requiring agencies to preserve electronically created records in electronic format came into effect. This bill codifies the OMB requirement. Codifying this requirement lends additional support to the National Archives and helps to promote electronic management of records. The bill includes additional reforms to ensure electronic presidential records are held to the same archival standards as those of the executive agencies. I encourage my colleagues to support this bipartisan legislation, and I yield back.
Gentleman from Florida yields back. I thank him for his excellent hard work on this issue, and now recognize the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Connolly, for 5 minutes for a statement on the bill.
I thank the chair, and I want to thank my friend from Florida for his leadership in this bill. I also want to thank the leadership of our ranking member, Elijah Cummings. This has been an issue I know both gentlemen have really worked on together, and I think it's important. And as the gentleman said, what this essentially does is codify the guidance that was provided by the archivist and the director of OMB back in 2012. It also directs the archivist to establish standards for preservation and management of email records that are presidential records. This is critical to this committee. We hope our committee will engage in vigorous oversight and use subpoena power and investigations to get at the truth, irrespective of who's in the White House. This bill is a tool that will help us do that job, and I think it has bipartisan support. And I support it and urge our colleagues to pass it, and I yield back.
Gentleman from Virginia yields back. Does any other member wish to be heard? Gentleman from Oklahoma is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
The gentleman may be referring to the next bill, and that
I'm
is my
sorry.
fault for being unclear, so I apologize to the gentleman from Oklahoma.
My error. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Might I inquire, Mr. Chairman, perhaps it would be better to move that amendment on this bill?
I'll let you and Mr. Russell sort that out. But I apologize to my friend from Oklahoma. I was my normal unclear self. So forgive me for that, and we will seek recognition for anyone who wants to be heard on Mr. Ross's bill. Gentlelady from Michigan is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Shortly after he was sworn in as Interior Secretary on March 1st, 2017, Secretary Zinke reportedly claimed that many Department of Interior employees were, quote, disloyal. Secretary Zinke also repeatedly promised a huge change by restructuring staff positions. In June 2017, the department reorganized dozens of career civil employees without providing a clear rationale. Mr. Chair, this body, I want to add, on October the 11th, 2017, Ranking Member Cummings wrote to the Department of Interior requesting documents, which was within his authority, regarding the reassignment of career civil servants, the costs associated with these reassignments, and how the reassignments serve taxpayers' interests. In December, the Interior Department confirmed that 33 members of the Senior Executive Service, 15% of the Career Senior Executive Service, received proposed or formal notices of reassignment. The department failed to produce any documents about the costs of the reassignments or any communications explaining how these reassignments would serve taxpayers' interests. The department also failed to respond to inquiries about when or whether it plans to produce the remaining documents. On February 27, Ranking Member Cummings wrote to request that Chairman Gowdy, yourself, sir, issue a subpoena to compel the production, to compel the production of these remaining documents or allow a vote. This request is even more urgent now because of the President's fiscal year 2019 budget states that the department will implement, quote, department-wide reorganization plan that will result in workplace reductions through, quote, a combination of attrition and separation. oversight over the reorganization of the Interior Department and the reassignment of career civil employees is well within our jurisdiction here on oversight and exactly what we should be doing. Mr. Chairman, would you commit in the future to scheduling a markup when the full committee could debate and vote on a subpoena for these documents?
I will be happy to add that to the lengthening list of things that Mr. Connolly and/or Mr. Cummings and I will talk about.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentlelady yields back. Does any other member wish to be heard? If not, the question is on favorably to reporting H.R. 1376. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Those opposed signify by saying no. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The bill is ordered favorably reported. Without objection, the motion is reconsidered is laid upon the table. Next item for consideration is H.R. 3303, the First Responder Fair Return for Employees on Their Initial Retirement Earned Act of 2017. The clerk will designate the bill.
H.R. 3303 to permit disabled law enforcement officers, Customs and Border Protection officers, firefighters, air traffic controllers, nuclear materials couriers, members of the Capitol Police, members of the Supreme Court Police, employees of the Central Intelligence Agency performing intelligence activities abroad or having specialized security requirements, and diplomatic security special agents of the Department of State to receive retirement benefits in the same manner as if they had not been disabled.
I ask unanimous consent the bill be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. Without objection, so ordered. It's my understanding the gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Russell, will offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute to the bill. The gentleman is recognized to call up his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 3303, offered by Mr. Russell of Oklahoma.
Without objection, the amendment is considered as read. The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes for a statement on the bill and his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I certainly applaud my friend and colleague, Mr. Connolly, for the underlying bill and what this is addressing with regard to our first responders. This amendment, I'm proud to co-sponsor on behalf of Representative Heiss from Georgia, who is the amendment's original author. Representative Connolly introduced, Mr. Chairman, the bill on July 19th of last year, and since its introduction, he and his staff have patiently worked with committee Republicans on changes to the bill that would improve it with some technical language. And I wish to thank him for working with us in such a good bipartisan fashion as he's known to do. Under current law, federal employees in certain high-risk and physically demanding positions are subject to mandatory retirement service and age requirements in order to ensure those key functions are performed safely and effectively. Those positions include federal law enforcement officers, firefighters, and air traffic controllers, among others. Because of the mandatory separation requirement, first responders are entitled to an annuity at an earlier age and computed at a higher rate. This annuity is paid for by higher employee and employer contributions throughout the employee's career compared to other federal employees. Under current law, a person working in a covered position who suffers a disabling injury in the line of duty can move to supervisory or administrative secondary positions to retain their experience and knowledge. In a secondary position, the covered employee maintains eligibility for enhanced annuity as well. If no secondary position is available, the employee may still work for the federal government, but in those cases, the employee loses his or her enhanced annuity and does not get refunded the extra money he or she paid into the annuity system for such a contingency. What that means is federal firefighters and law enforcers who are injured on the job and unable to return to a first responder position lose all of their benefits that they paid for, even if they return to work for the federal government in a different role. This will correct that. Hardworking first responders who put their lives on the line for our safety and for our country deserve better. The First Responder Fair Retire Act will allow former first responders who cannot continue in their positions but who can still provide honorable service to the country to maintain eligibility for an enhanced annuity. This benefit will apply regardless of whether a secondary position exists. The employee will continue to make higher annuity contributions while in their new position. The higher annuity calculation will end when the employee meets the mandatory separation requirements that would have applied to the original first responder position. We thank all of our first responders who provide invaluable service to our communities and to our nation. We especially thank those who are injured in the line of duty and who give their lives in service to this nation. I want to thank Representative Connolly for his leadership in taking up this issue and for looking out for those first responders. And I also want to thank Representative Heiss and others that have worked in a bipartisan fashion so that we can provide good government to an awful lot of good people. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I urge my colleagues to support and yield back.
The gentleman from Oklahoma yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Connolly, for 5 minutes for a statement on the bill.
I thank the chair, and I thank my friend from Oklahoma, Mr. Russell, for his thoughtful contribution and for his support for this legislation. I'm proud to be the original author of the First Responder Fair Return for employees, and the situation is, as Mr. Russell described it, these are hazardous jobs, and Congress made allowance for that in terms of making sure that people who might be injured in these jobs or in some way disabled are protected. And so we're trying to enhance that, because part of the problem is when first responders become injured and can't complete the essential functions of their jobs, they can be placed in a civil service position that is no longer eligible for 6C benefits. And I think that's an injustice. I think Mr. Russell does too. And so this bill is designed, and the substitute is designed to try to right that wrong and to address that issue. I have 5 letters of support for the bill from the National Federation of Federal Employees, the American Federation of Government Employees, the National Treasury Employees Union, the International Association of Firefighters, and the Federal Law Enforcement Officers Association. And I'd ask unanimous consent they be entered into the record.
Without objection.
And with that, Mr. Chairman, I join Mr. Russell in urging our colleagues to pass this important piece of legislation and provide a remedy to a carve-out that was not intended by the Congress to protect these brave men and women who protect us all. And I yield back.
The gentleman from Virginia yields back. The gentleman from South Carolina is recognized for 5 minutes to speak on the bill.
And I may end up yielding to either of the sponsors in this instance. I very much applaud the sentiment. I absolutely applaud what you're trying to get at in terms of protecting the families that are affected in the wake of tragedy. My simple question to you, and we might just enter in a colloquy here, is just on the pay for. As I understand, it's very limited. We're probably talking less than 50 people a year. It's quite limited in terms of scope. But again, always a pet peeve of mine is how do we pay for this stuff? Because if not, they're always in a little bit of addition here and a little bit of addition there, and it does add up over time.
Well, fair enough. I think it's relatively manageable. I think it's also important to remember that these individuals are also paying into the retirement system at a higher rate in order to cover.
But in fairness, the retirement system in either instance doesn't really pay for itself, and there's an unfunded
that's right.
liability
There's also an employer contribution and match. That's absolutely true. But remember, we'll see how it's scored, but if these folks were not injured and continued in their employment, that's already accounted for in the budget. There is, right, at a higher
No, absolutely.
At a higher
but it's
cost.
just it's simply a new friction point in terms of actionable items.
Yes, but it's really more of a bookkeeping entry issue in terms of new costs than it is actually a new cost. It's not like we're creating a new program. We're trying to protect the status, the retirement status and benefit that they're entitled to under 6C because of.
Understood.
I would say a
I mean,
hole in the
ideally
wall.
during the intertwining 20 years that might follow, or 15 years that might follow, the idea is that there'd be, in essence, worth created by that employee for the federal government that would offset some of the costs.
And the best answer I can give my friend right now, and we can try to get a more detailed answer if we have it, and that is that these have to be baked, assuming this becomes a law, this would have to be baked into the respective budgets of these agencies as it already actually is. And I'd yield to my friend from Oklahoma for his comment.
And I thank the gentleman from Virginia, and I thank the gentleman from South Carolina. I think one of the factors, as you rightly pointed out, that the recipients of this are actually very small in number, but the contributors are broad. Everyone agrees to pay a little bit higher in case these contingencies happen. They agree to that. And just like actuaries in the insurance industry, for the small numbers that it applies to, they are covered. And so that is a key important aspect of the pay for.
Okay. Reclaiming my time, I think that really is the point. It is true that it will cost net some additional money for this small additional population, but I think it's already accounted for because the assumption is you don't get injured and you qualify for 6C and you retire under that. And so it is more of a bookkeeping entry than it is a net new cost to the federal government. But we'll try to make sure we have a definitive answer for my friend.
That sounds like a back of the envelope calculation in terms of a pay for, but I respect the point made, and with that, would yield back.
I thank my friend.
Yes, sir.
The gentleman from South Carolina yields back. Does any other member wish to be heard? Gentlelady from the Virgin Islands.
Thank you very much. I'm very pleased that we would have legislation that discusses the needs of first responders, their retirement, the needs of those individuals who put themselves on the line immediately with responding to issues of great importance here in the United States. However, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to bring up another issue that we are concerned with that relates to first responders. It relates to those issues that occur immediately after catastrophic events. As you're aware, in October, Ranking Member Cummings requested that you join him in sending document requests to 5 entities: the White House, the Department of Defense, Department of Homeland Security, Department of Health and Services, Human Services, and the Governor of Puerto Rico. And that was related to conduct oversight of the executive branch's response to the catastrophic hurricanes that struck Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands. And those document requests actually mirror the requests that were sent by Republican Tom Davis in his role as chairman of the Select Committee after Hurricane Katrina some years ago. At this time, there's been a refusal on the chairman's part to send letters to the governor of Puerto Rico or the White House, and no explanation was given why the White House would not receive that. To date, the Department of Defense has made only one production on December 19th, 2017, and this production included only a few pages of email communication. They provided no timeline when they would give the rest of those document requests. These documents are really important to my constituents who have serious unanswered questions regarding the delayed Department of Defense response, particularly on the island of St. John, which was isolated after the hurricanes, and the slow execution of the Blue Tarp mission. With the next hurricane season beginning in less than 3 months, American people need answers to these types of questions. While we are having discussions about first responders and some of the other important issues that this committee has taken up, I would request that this committee really take seriously the previous request from Ranking Member Cummings, and that they would, if not a letter be sent, that a vote would be taken permitting us to have this discussion at the next markup. Thank you. I yield back.
I appreciate the gentlelady's unparalleled passion and advocacy on behalf of this issue, and I will add that to the burgeoning list of things that Mr. Connolly and I have to discuss next week. The gentlelady yields back. Does any other member wish to be heard on this bill? If not, the question is now on the amendment in the nature of substitute. All those in favor signify by saying aye. All those opposed signify by saying no. The opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. The question is now on favorably reporting H.R. 3303 as amended. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed signify by saying no. The opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The bill is ordered favorably reported. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. The next item for consideration is H.R. 4446. The clerk will designate the bill.
H.R. 4446, to amend the Virgin Islands of the United States Centennial Commission Act to extend the expiration date of the commission and for other purposes.
I ask unanimous consent the bill be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. Without objection, so ordered. It's my understanding the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Grothman, will offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute to the bill, and the gentleman is recognized to call up his amendment. Clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 4446, offered by Mr. Grothman of Wisconsin.
Without objection, the amendment is considered as read. The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes for a statement on the bill and his amendment.
Thank you. Congress has established the Virgin Islands of the United States Centennial Commission to plan and carry out events commemorating the 100th anniversary of the transfer of the Virgin Islands from Denmark to the United States on March 31st, 2017. Because the appointment of 2 members of the Commission was delayed by more than a year, the Commission has not yet convened its members. As a result, no events have been planned or carried out at this time, and there is no final report available detailing the Commission's activities. This amendment extends the life of the Commission by 1 year to give it more time to plan events celebrating this important moment in American history, and delays the deadline for submitting the final report by 1 year. Consistent with the committee practice regarding commemorative commissions, Section 11 of the original legislation states that no federal funds are authorized or may be obligated for the commission. This amendment does not alter that language, and the commission will remain ineligible for federal funding. I'm proud to be a co-sponsor of this bill, and I urge my colleagues to support the bill.
The gentleman from Wisconsin yields back. The gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Connolly, is recognized for 5 minutes for a statement on the bill.
Mr. Chairman, I want to thank my friend from the Virgin Islands, who is always vigilant about issues that affect her constituents and has been a passionate advocate on behalf of the Virgin Islands post-hurricane devastation, and we thank her for her leadership and guidance. Also thank Mr. Grothman for his concern and contribution to this matter. We support the bill, H.R. 4446. It's a necessary measure and urge its passage.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you very much, Chairman Gowdy and Ranking Member for Connolly, Vice Ranking Member Connolly, for bringing H.R. 4446 to markup with the opportunity to speak on the behalf. The amendment in the nature of a substitute simply extends the termination date of the Virgin Islands of the United States Centennial Commission from September 30th, 2018 to September 30th, 2019. This bill was created to commemorate the 100th anniversary of the Virgin Islands of the United States becoming an unincorporated territory. Since its creation, the Commission has seen the appointments of Senators Lisa Murkowski, Senator Bill Nelson, Marco Rubio, as well as Representatives Tom McCarthy and Mia Love, and the Assistant Secretary for Insular Affairs, who's recently been confirmed, Douglas Domenech. Passage of the ANS would allow the Commission to fully accomplish its mission before concluding by extending the final report and termination deadlines by a year to January 31st, 2019, and September 30th, 2019, respectively. As you all are aware, the catastrophic damage from the 2 unprecedented Category 5 hurricanes has meant that much of our attention and energies have been placed on those and have not, in fact, been, as I would have liked, to have been involved in this commemoration committee. However, it is the belief that the recovering American citizens residing on the islands would benefit greatly from continued congressional recognition, commemoration, the activities, and the hearings that we hope to have during that time. I, along with the support of my colleagues, have worked tirelessly since September on these efforts. This commission has received national and international support, and an extended lifespan of the commission would allow it to better benefit from this support and further examine the often inadequate relationship between the territory and the rest of the United States, and the territory's path not only to recovery, but to a better relationship and better understanding of the history that we have and what the next 100 years as American citizens will be. I urge my colleagues to support the congressional recognition of the Virgin Islands of the United States at this amendment. And thank you, Mr. Chairman, for bringing this to passage, being so caring and concerned about not only our recovery, but us as citizens of the United States and that commemoration, and being such a great friend, not only of the Virgin Islands, but myself. Thank you.
The gentlelady yields back, and I do want to agree with my friend from Virginia. There is no more persistent, passionate or persuasive member of this body than the gentlelady from the Virgin Islands, as you would expect from a former prosecutor. So thank you for everything you do on behalf of the people you represent. Does any other member wish to be heard? If not, the question is now on the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed signify by saying no. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The question is now on favorably reporting H.R. 4446 as amended. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed signify by saying no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The bill is ordered favorably reported as amended. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. The committee will now consider the following postal naming bills en bloc. En bloc. En banc is a legal term. I'll have to save that for another day. H.R. 2979, H.R. 4574, H.R. 4722, H.R. 4840, H.R. 4890, H.R. 4960, and S. 931. I ask unanimous consent the bills be ordered favorably reported to the House of Representatives. Without objection, so ordered. In addition, I ask unanimous consent the postal naming bills H.R. 1496 and H.R. 3184 be ordered favorably reported as amended by their respective amendments in the nature of a substitute at the desk. Without objection, so ordered. The committee will now stand in recess at the call of the chair. We will reconvene at 1:30 to resume consideration of H.R. 50. The committee stands in recess. Committee will come to order. The committee will now resume consideration of H.R. 50, the Unfunded Mandates Information Transparency Act of 2017. Questions on favorably reporting H.R. 50 as amended. A recorded vote having previously been ordered, the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Gowdy?
Yes.
Mr. Gowdy votes yes. Mr. Duncan? Mr. Issa? Mr. Jordan? Mr. Jordan votes yes. Mr. Sanford? Mr. Sanford votes yes. Mr. Amash? Mr. Amash votes yes. Mr. Gosar? Mr. Desjardins? Mr. Farenthold? Mr. Farenthold votes yes. Ms. Fox? Ms. Fox votes yes. Mr. Massey? Mr. Massey votes yes. Mr. Meadows? Mr. Meadows votes yes. Mr. DeSantis? Mr. Ross? Mr. Ross votes yes. Mr. Walker? Mr. Walker votes yes. Mr. Blum? Mr. Blum votes aye. Mr. Heiss? Mr. Heiss votes yes. Mr. Russell? Mr. Russell votes yes. Mr. Grothman? Mr. Hurd? Mr. Hurd votes yes. Mr. Palmer? Mr. Palmer votes yes. Mr. Comer? Mr. Comer votes yes. Mr. Mitchell? Mr. Mitchell votes yes. Mr. Gianforte? Mr. Gianforte votes yes. Mr. Cummings? Ms. Maloney? No. Ms. Maloney votes no. Ms. Norton?
No.
Ms. Norton votes no. Mr. Clay? Mr. Lynch? Mr. Lynch votes no. Mr. Cooper? Mr. Connolly?
Nay.
Mr. Connolly votes nay. Ms. Kelly? Ms. Kelly votes no. Ms. Lawrence? Ms. Watson-Coleman? Ms. Watson-Coleman votes no. Mr. Krishnamurthy? Mr. Raskin? Mr. Gomez? Mr. Welch? Mr. Cartwright?
No.
Mr. Cartwright votes no. Mr. Desaulniers? Mr. Desaulniers votes no. Ms. Plaskett? Mr. Sarbanes? Mr. Sarbanes votes no. You are not recorded. Mr. Clay votes no.
The gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Dr. Desjardins.
Mr. Desjardins votes yes.
The gentleman from Montana? I think he's already voted. Is Mr. Gianforte recorded?
Yes, he is.
The gentleman from Wisconsin?
Mr. Grothman votes yes.
Mr. Lynch, have you been recorded? Has Mr. Lynch been recorded?
Mr. Lynch voted no.
Thank you.
Have all members voted? The clerk will report the tally.
Mr. Chairman, on this vote, there are 20 ayes and 10 noes.
The ayes have it. The bill is ordered favorably reported as amended. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. I ask unanimous consent that staff be allowed to make necessary technical and conforming changes to the bills ordered reported today, subject to the approval of the minority. Without objection, so ordered. If there's no further business, and before we adjourn, I just want to thank everybody for being here. I know that there are a lot of demands on your time, and I appreciate the quality and nature of the discussion and the debate, and it's been a privilege to be with you for the better part of half a day. With that, the committee stands adjourned.